He watched his brother drown, saving him. That single, shattering moment birthed a darkness no amount of paint could ever cover, shaping the man who turned his back on the world to stare into the void. Casper David Friedrich, a forgotten ghost of romanticism, whose canvases held the terrifying silence of nature and a mind teetering on the edge of sanity. This is his story. Introduction. The ice cracked, and the world went silent. In the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea, a 13-year-old boy watched his younger brother slip beneath the surface, drowning to save him. It was a single, shattering moment that would haunt Casper David Friedrich for the rest of his existence, birthing a darkness that no amount of paint could ever truly cover. He was the man who turned his back on the viewer to stare into the void. His canvases were filled with fog, crumbling ruins, and the terrifying silence of nature, challenging the very definition of art in an era of revolution and war. But behind the masterpieces lay a mind teetering on the edge of sanity, plagued by accusations of treason, political paranoia, and a crippling solitude. How did a radical recluse become the forgotten ghost of romanticism, only to rise from the ashes centuries later? To understand the beauty, you must first survive the storm. Chapter 1. The Boy Beneath the Ice, a tragedy in Greifswald. To understand the silence that pervades the work of Casper David Friedrich, one must first understand the noise that preceded it, the sharp, thunderous crack of fracturing ice, followed by the suffocating quiet of a winter grave. Before he was the master of the romantic sublime, before he was the brooding recluse of Dresden, he was merely a boy in Greifswald, a small university town huddled against the biting winds of the Baltic coast. It was here, in the unforgiving chill of Swedish Pomerania, that the artist's soul was forged not in the warmth of a studio, but in the freezing waters of a tragedy that would define his existence. The year was 1787. Greifswald was a place of brick Gothic architecture and strict Lutheran piety, a town where the sky often mirrored the slate-grey waters of the nearby sea. For young Casper, life was already acquainted with the spectre of death. He was the 6th of 10 children born into a household that smelled of tallow and soap, the trade of his father, Adolf Gottlieb Friedrich. The Friedrich home was a place of severe discipline and religious devotion, a fortress of pietism where emotions were often sublimated into prayer. But prayers could not stop the steady attrition of the family circle. Casper was only 7 years old when he first looked into the face of mortality, watching his mother, Sophie Dorothea, succumb to illness. Her death left a void in the household, a cold draught that the heat of the soap-boiling fires could never quite dispel. Yet, the loss of a mother, while devastating, was a natural tragedy, a sorrowful inevitability of the era. What happened 6 years later was something different entirely. It was unnatural, violent, and laden with a specific agonizing guilt that would carve the hollow outlines of the Rücken figure, the lonely figure turned away from the world, into Casper's psyche forever. It was December 8th. The winter had come early and hard to the Baltic coast, turning the landscape into a study of white and grey. For 13-year-old Casper and his younger brother, Johann Christopher, the freeze was not a warning but an invitation. The frozen ditches and moats surrounding the town fortifications offered a glistening playground, a temporary liberation from the sombre atmosphere of their father's house. They were boys, possessed by the reckless immortality of youth, skating and sliding on the surface of a sleeping killer. The historical accounts of that afternoon vary in their minute details, obscured by the fog of time and the myth-making that surrounds great men, but the core of the horror remains undisputed. The brothers were out on the ice, perhaps venturing too far from the safety of the bank, perhaps testing the limits of the frozen sheet that separated them from the black water below. Casper, the older but perhaps more fragile of the two, found himself in peril. The ice, stressed beyond its limit, gave way. In an instant, the solid world vanished. Casper plunged into the freezing water, the shock of the cold surely knocking the breath from his lungs. It is a specific kind of terror, falling through ice, the sudden transition from light to darkness, the weight of soaked woolen clothes dragging one down, the panic of limbs thrashing against the jagged edges of the broken crust. He was drowning. The future painter of the abyss was being swallowed by it. But he did not die. Johann Christopher, smaller but driven by a ferocious instinct to protect his older brother, acted. He did not run for help. He did not hesitate. He reached for Casper. In the chaotic struggle that ensued, a blur of freezing spray and desperate grasping, Johann managed to push or pull Casper towards safety. He saved his brother S' life. But the exchange demanded a price. As Casper clawed his way back onto the solid ice, gasping and shivering, the surface betrayed Johann. The younger boy slipped beneath the water, and the ice, cruel and indifferent, closed the path back to the air. Casper David Friedrich stood on the frozen edge, alive, while his saviour vanished into the murky depths. One can only imagine the frantic, screaming silence that followed, the seconds that stretched into minutes as the water settled, sealing the tomb, the realization that the movement below the surface had stopped. The walk back to the town was not just a journey home, it was a march into a life sentence of survivor S's guilt. He had to return to his father, the stern soap boiler, and explain that he was alive only because Johann was dead. The trauma of that day did not end with the funeral. It festered. It became a lens through which Casper viewed the world. In the years that followed, the boy withdrew. The playful child died in the water with Johann. What emerged was a melancholic youth who found solace only in solitude. He began to wander the fields and shores of Greifswald alone, staring for hours at the horizon, at the interplay of fog and light, at the twisted, leafless trees that clawed at the winter sky. He was looking for something in the landscape, perhaps a sign of God, perhaps a sign of forgiveness, or perhaps he was simply keeping a vigil for the brother who lay beneath the ice. This tragedy explains the haunting stillness of his later masterpieces. When you look at the Sea of Ice or the Monk by the Sea, you're not looking at a mere depiction of nature. You're looking through the eyes of the 13-year-old boy standing on the edge of the broken ice, staring into the void. The vast, indifferent power of nature, the fragility of human life, the overwhelming silence of the divine, these were not intellectual concepts for Friedrich. They were memories. The drowning of Johann Christopher was the crescendo of a symphony of death that played throughout his youth. Death was a frequent visitor to the Friedrich home. Before Johann, there was his mother. Shortly after, in 1791, his sister Maria died of typhus. The following year, another sister, Elizabeth, passed away. By the time Casper reached adulthood, he had buried almost half of his immediate family. He was a young man intimately acquainted with the grave, living in a house where the silence of the missing was louder than the voices of the living. This relentless exposure to mortality shattered his faith in the permanence of the material world. While his contemporaries in the art world were obsessed with the classical ideals of Rome or the heroic narratives of history painting, Friedrich turned his gaze inward. He began to understand that the only true reality was the spiritual one, and that nature was the mirror of the soul. But it was a dark mirror. His nature was not the sun-drenched pastoral of the south. It was the gothic, misty, melancholic north. It was the graveyard in the snow. It was the ship trapped in the ice. The guilt of survival likely fueled his intense, almost fanatical religious introspection. If God had spared him, if his brother had been sacrificed for him, then his life must have a purpose. He could not simply be a soap boiler like his father. He had been saved for something else. This burden of destiny, combined with his depressive temperament, pushed him toward art not as a profession, but as a necessity. Drawing became a way to exorcise the ghosts, to give form to the feelings that words could not express. Greifswald, with its crumbling ruins of Eldina Abbey and its sweeping views of the Baltic, became his first studio. He would sketch the ruins obsessively, drawn to the way nature reclaimed the works of man. These were not just studies of architecture, they were meditations on decay. The broken arches of the abbey against the sky were like the broken ice of that December day, beautiful, tragic, and enduring. As he grew older, the town became too small for his grief and his ambition. He needed to escape the physical reminders of his loss, even if he carried the psychological ones with him. The local drawing teacher, Johann Gottfried Quistorp, recognized the boy's talent, a talent born of deep observation and deeper sorrow. Quistorp encouraged him to look beyond the topographical accuracy of the era and to see the spirit of the landscape. He saw that young Casper did not just paint trees and rocks, he painted the mood of the air itself. But the boy beneath the ice never truly left him. Throughout his life, Friedrich would return to the theme of the traveller, the wanderer standing on the precipice. In his most famous works, the figure is always facing away from us, gazing into the distance. We cannot see their face. We cannot see if they are crying, or praying, or simply numb. We only see their back, rigid against the vastness of the world. It is the stance of a witness. It is the stance of a boy watching a tragedy he is powerless to stop. The drowning of Johann Christopher was the primal wound of Casper David Friedrich's life. It taught him that nature was not a benevolent garden, but a sublime and terrifying force that gives and takes without reason. It taught him that silence is the language of God, and it taught him that to be an artist, a true artist of the romantic spirit, one must be willing to stand in the cold, alone, and look into the dark water until it reveals its secrets. This was the origin of the tragedy of landscape. Before he could revolutionize art, before he could challenge the academies of Europe, Casper David Friedrich had to survive his own history. He had to learn to live with the ghost of his brother, a phantom that would guide his hand across the canvas for the rest of his days. The ice had cracked, and the boy had fallen in, but the artist who climbed out was changed forever, carrying a shard of that frozen winter in his heart. He was ready to leave Greifswald, to seek training in Copenhagen and eventually destiny in Dresden, but he would never truly leave the ice. He would spend his life painting it, over and over again, trying to make sense of the day the world went silent. Chapter 2: Copenhagen's Ghost. Learning to see in the dark. Greifswald was a graveyard of memories, a place where every cobblestone and every gust of Baltic wind whispered the name of a dead brother. To survive, Casper David Friedrich had to leave. In 1794, at the age of 20, he packed his meagre belongings and travelled north, crossing the water to the capital of Denmark. Copenhagen was known then as the Florence of the North, a beacon of enlightenment, culture, and reason. It was a city of spires, bustling ports, and the prestigious Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. But Friedrich did not arrive as a typical student seeking fame or fortune. He arrived as a refugee from his own history, carrying a quiet, suffocating darkness that the bright lights of the Danish capital could not illuminate. The Copenhagen Academy was a temple to the neoclassical ideal. Here, art was a matter of mathematics, proportion, and the emulation of the ancients. Students sat in neat rows, scratching charcoal across paper, copying the serene blank faces of plaster Greek gods. They were taught that beauty lay in symmetry, in the rational ordering of the world, and that the job of the artist was to polish nature until it gleamed with perfection. For a young man whose soul had been fractured by the senseless brutality of the ice, this curriculum was both a discipline and a prison. Friedrich sat among them, silent and diligent, mastering the technical skills of perspective and anatomy. Yet internally, he was miles away. He was learning the grammar of art, but he had no interest in speaking their language. His primary instructors were giants of the era. There was Jens Juel, a master of portraiture and landscape who painted the world with a soft, glowing intimacy. From Juel, Friedrich learned the subtle mechanics of light, how it filters through foliage, how it catches on the edge of a cloud. But where Jules saw a benevolent pastoral nature, Friedrich saw something else. He saw the shadows that stretched long across the grass. He saw the melancholy in the fading light. Then there was Nikolai Abildgaard, a more volatile figure who dabbled in Norse mythology and the dramatic, shadowy aesthetics of the Sturm und Drang movement. In Abildgaard, Friedrich found a faint echo of his own turmoil, a permission to look beyond the sunny Italian vistas the Academy adored and into the misty, rugged myths of the North. However, the true education of Casper David Friedrich did not happen in the lecture halls. It happened in the solitude of his own wanderings. He became a ghost in the city, a pale, red-haired figure stalking the perimeter of social life. He did not drink in the taverns with other students. He did not chase the affections of local girls. Instead, he walked. He walked the meticulously manicured paths of the Frederiksberg Gardens, and he walked the wilder, windswept coastlines north of the city. It was during these lonely excursions that the ghost of his style began to manifest. He began to draw nature not as a backdrop for human action, but as a protagonist in its own right. Yet his drawings from this period possess a terrifying clinical precision. He did not splash paint with wild emotion. He controlled it with an almost obsessive rigidity. He worked primarily in sepia and ink, eschewing the vibrant colours of oil painting. This choice was telling. He was stripping the world of its distraction, reducing it to geometry, tone and line. He was learning to see in the dark. By restricting himself to the monochromatic, he forced his eye to understand the structure of emptiness. He drew trees that looked like skeletons, their branches reaching out like desperate fingers. He drew ruins that felt heavier than the paper they were sketched upon. The discipline of the Academy gave him the tools to render the world realistically, but his trauma gave him the vision to render it strangely. Then, the city itself offered him a lesson in destruction. In June of 1795, a year after his arrival, a catastrophic fire swept through Copenhagen. It started in an old naval base, and fueled by strong winds, tore through the medieval heart of the capital. For 2 days the sky turned an apocalyptic orange, and the air was thick with the taste of ash. Friedrich watched as the rational, ordered city of the Enlightenment was consumed by chaos. He saw the great hall of Christiansborg Palace collapse. He saw the spires of churches turn into torches. While other artists might have fled or wept, Friedrich observed. This was the second great lesson of his life, a fiery counterpoint to the freezing water of his childhood. Nature, whether in the form of ice or fire, was indifferent to human endeavours. The fire confirmed what the ice had taught him. Safety is an illusion. He sketched the aftermath, but not as a journalist documenting an event. He sketched the ruins as monuments to silence. The charred beams and hollowed-out windows of Copenhagen became symbols of transience. In the blackened skeletons of buildings, he found a visual language for the grief that he carried. The ghost of his brother was no longer just a memory of a drowning boy. It was becoming a universal presence, haunting the very architecture of the world Friedrich depicted. It was in Copenhagen that Friedrich also began to read voraciously, diving into the poetry of the German Romantics and the theology of Pietism. He began to understand that his isolation was not a defect, but a requirement. "To become what I am, I must be alone," he would later write. The bustling social scene of the Academy, with its awards and competitions, felt increasingly trivial. He realized that the artist's eye must be turned inward as much as outward. The teacher says, "Look at nature," but the spirit says, "Look at how nature makes you feel." This was a radical departure from the academic doctrine of the time. He was developing the conviction that a painter should not just paint what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him. If he sees nothing within, then he should stop painting what is before him. As his time in Denmark neared its end, a subtle transformation had taken place. The awkward, traumatized boy from Greifswald had become a man of formidable, if quiet, intensity. He had mastered the rules of art well enough to know exactly how he intended to break them. He had learned that while the academy could teach him how to draw a tree, it could not teach him how to make that tree look lonely. That was a secret he had to dredge up from his own soul. By 1798, Copenhagen had nothing left to teach him. The Florence of the North was too flat, too rational, too bright. He craved mountains. He craved the deep, dark forests of Germany. He craved a landscape that matched the topography of his own spirit. He looked south, toward Dresden, the city that would become the epicenter of German Romanticism. But he did not leave Copenhagen empty-handed. He left with a portfolio of sepia drawings that were unlike anything his professors had ever seen technically perfect, yet disturbing in their stillness. He left with the ghost of Copenhagen beside him, not a spectre of fear, but a guide. He had learned that darkness was not just the absence of light. It was a medium, a substance to be shaped and moulded. He had learned that in the silence of a ruin, or the fog of a coastline, one could hear the voice of God more clearly than in any cathedral. He was ready to challenge the world, to turn the tragedy of landscape into a new religion of art. The ice had broken him, but the fire and discipline of Copenhagen had forged the pieces into something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous to the established order. Casper David Friedrich was no longer just a witness to tragedy. He was becoming its poet. He boarded the packet boat for Germany, leaving the flat horizon of Denmark behind, his eyes fixed on the invisible mountains of the future, ready to paint the silence that had followed him all his life. Chapter 3. The Altar of Nature. A scandal in Dresden. Dresden in 1798 was not merely a city, it was a crucible. While Copenhagen had been a place of discipline and salt spray, Dresden was a city of stone, river, and intellect, simmering with the early heat of a cultural revolution. Casper David Friedrich arrived as a stranger, a 24-year-old man with eyes the colour of the Baltic Sea, and a demeanour that suggested he was constantly listening to a sound no one else could hear. He did not plunge into the social whirl of the Saxon capital. He did not court the favours of the salonière, or drink in the noisy taverns where philosophy was debated until dawn. Instead, he drifted to the edges, inhabiting a small Spartan room that felt less like an artist's studio and more like a monk's cell. He had come to the epicentre of German art, but he found the academy there stifling. The professors preached the glory of antiquity. They wanted Greek heroes, Roman ruins, and the grand narratives of history painting. They believed that nature was merely a backdrop, a stage set for human drama. Friedrich, however, carried a different conviction in his chest, forged in the ice of Sweden and the tragedy of his childhood. He believed that nature was not the background, it was the protagonist. It was the face of God, veiled in mist. For days, sometimes weeks, Friedrich would vanish. He did not go to the museums to copy the masters. He went to the Elbe Sandstone Mountains, a geological wonder just south of the city later dubbed Saxon Switzerland. Here, the earth had been ripped open. Great pillars of sandstone rose like ruined cathedrals from the forest floor, jagged spires piercing the fog. It was a landscape of violent beauty, a place where the scale of the world reduced a man to nothingness. Friedrich did not just hike these trails, he haunted them. He walked at dawn when the mist was thick enough to swallow a man whole. He walked at twilight when the shadows stretched like fingers across the valley. Observers, if there were any to see him, would have found his behaviour unsettling. He would stand before a rock formation or a solitary pine tree for hours, motionless, his gaze intense and unblinking. He was not sketching. His sketchbook often remained closed in his pocket. He was engaging in a process he called the inner eye. He believed that a painter should not paint what he saw before him, but what he saw within him. If he saw nothing within, he should stop painting what was before him. He was memorizing the spiritual geometry of the landscape, waiting for the scenery to dissolve into a feeling. Years passed in this quiet gestation. He worked in sepia, creating drawings that were technically precise, yet unnervingly empty. They won prizes, but they whispered rather than shouted. The art world of Dresden respected his hand, but puzzled over his soul. They did not know that he was sharpening his blade, preparing to cut the tether between art and academic tradition. The moment of impact, the scandal that would define his career and birth the true Romantic era, arrived in 1808. It began with a commission, or perhaps a misunderstanding of one. The Count of Thun Hohenstein had requested a painting for his family chapel at Teschen Castle in Bohemia. The expectation was orthodox, a traditional religious scene, perhaps a crucifixion or a saint, rendered in the established style. What Friedrich created instead was a heresy that would shake the foundations of Western art. He retreated into his studio, a room so barren it frightened his few visitors. There was nothing on the walls, no sketches, no studies, no clutter. Just a wooden easel, a palette, and a silence so heavy it felt pressurized. For months he worked on a canvas that defied categorization. He painted a mountain peak, rugged and steep, rising from the darkness of a fir forest. At the summit, bathed in the unnatural golden light of a setting sun, or perhaps a rising one, stood a crucifix. But the cross was tiny. It was not the dominant figure of the composition. It was a speck against the vastness of the sky, entwined with ivy, turned away from the viewer, facing the dying light. This was the cross in the mountains, later known as the Tetschen altar. It was a radical inversion of hierarchy. For centuries the Church had taught that man was the centre of creation, and nature was his dominion. Friedrich S. Brush argued the opposite, that the divine was found in the overwhelming silence of the wild, and that the cross was merely a man-made symbol trying to reach a god who was already present in the clouds and the rock. The unveiling of the painting was an act of calculated theatre. Friedrich did not simply hang it on a wall. He transformed his studio into a sanctuary. He darkened the windows, allowing only a specific, controlled light to fall upon the canvas, which he placed on a table draped in black cloth. It was Christmas, 1808. He invited the public not to view a picture, but to witness a revelation. The reaction was a mixture of awe and confusion. Visitors entered the darkened room and spoke in whispers. The painting, with its gilded frame designed by Friedrich himself, carved with Eucharistic symbols, the eye of God, and wheat sheaves, demanded to be treated as an icon. But where were the saints? Where were the angels? There was only the mountain, the trees, and the light. Some wept, overcome by a religious sentiment they couldn't name. They felt the tragedy of a landscape that Friedrich had sought to capture the crushing beauty of the sublime. But in the shadowed corners of the Dresden art establishment, knives were being sharpened. The old guard viewed this altarpiece not as innovation, but as desecration. The attack, when it came, was vicious and public. It was led by Basilius von Ramdor, a chamberlain, diplomat, and fierce defender of neoclassicism. Ramdor did not just dislike the painting, he was offended by it on a moral and intellectual level. In January 1809, Ramdor published a scathing critique in the Zeitung für die elegante Welt, Journal for the Elegant World. His words were designed to destroy. He accused Friedrich of presumption. He argued that landscape painting was an inferior genre, capable only of decoration, certainly not of carrying deep religious weight. To place a landscape on an altar was, to Ramdor, a theological error bordering on pantheism. He ridiculed the perspective, asking how the viewer could be floating in the air to see the mountain peak without a foreground. He mocked the lighting, but his real fear was exposed in his most biting comment. It is true presumption when landscape painting wants to sneak into the church and creep onto the altar. Ramdor saw the danger clearly. If the divine could be found in a pine tree or a sunset, then the church, the academy, and the entire structure of ordered society were unnecessary. Friedrich was democratizing the soul. The Ramdor dispute exploded into a cultural war. It was the talk of Dresden. Friedrich, usually a man of few words, found himself in the eye of a storm. His friends, the poets and philosophers of the Romantic movement, rallied to his defense, sensing that this was the battle line for the future of German spirit. But Friedrich, hurt and agitated, decided to break his own silence. In a rare move, he wrote a rebuttal. He did not apologize. He did not retreat. He doubled down. He explained that the sun setting behind the mountain represented the passing of the old order, the pre-Christian world, while the cross reflected the light of Christ, but a Christ who was one with the suffering and beauty of the earth. He declared that art was not about the faithful representation of air, water, rocks, and trees, but about the artist's soul reflecting the soul of nature. The painter should paint not only what he has in front of him, but also what he sees inside himself, he famously wrote during this period. The controversy did not destroy him, it made him. The scandal stripped away the polite veneer of the Dresden art scene and revealed Friedrich as the visionary he was. He had dared to turn a landscape into a prayer. He had placed the altar of nature before the public and forced them to look into the abyss. The Techen altar was eventually purchased by the Count despite the uproar, but the victory was greater than the sale. Friedrich had established a new visual language. He had proven that a painting could be a vehicle for the deepest existential dread and the higher spiritual hope, all without a single human face to tell the story. He had brought the silence of the ice and the melancholy of the ruin into the gallery, and he had made the critics stare at it until they blinked. As the dust of the scandal settled, Friedrich returned to his studio. The noise of the Ramdor dispute faded, replaced once again by the silence he craved. But he was changed. He was no longer the student, or the ghost of Copenhagen. He was the master of the romantic landscape. The controversy had hardened his resolve. He knew now that his path would be lonely, for he was walking where others could not follow. He turned his back on the city, on the critics, and on the light of the salon. He looked back to the canvas, to the mist and the mountains. He picked up his brush. The world was vast, terrifying, and waiting to be painted. The scandal in Dresden was over, but the journey into the deep night of the soul had only just begun. Chapter 4. Into the Abyss, the Monk, and the Infinite Void. The door to the Dresden studio clicked shut, sealing out the clamour of the city and the lingering echoes of the Ramdor controversy. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil, a smell that Casper David Friedrich associated not with craft, but with a kind of holy confinement. He was 34 years old, vindicated by his critics but internally restless. The Techen altar had been a declaration of war against traditional landscape painting, but his next move would not be a battle. It would be a surrender to the void. He stood before a large horizontal canvas, staring at the weave of the linen until it blurred. He was not looking for a subject. He was looking for the absence of one. Friedrich had spent his life observing the boundaries of the world, the jagged lines where rock met sky, the fuzzy indistinctness where fog met water. But now he felt compelled to remove the boundaries altogether. He travelled in his mind back to the Baltic coast, to the island of Rügen, and further still, to the edges of the known world where the sea became a slate of infinite grey. He began to paint, but this process was unlike the meticulous construction of the cross in the mountains. This was a stripping away. He laid down bands of colour that defied the rules of the academy, a sliver of white sand at the bottom, a band of black-blue churning water, and then the sky. The sky took up 5/6 of the canvas, a massive, oppressive weight of nothingness that pressed down on the horizon. There was no framing device. There were no repoussoir trees to guide the eye, no mountains to offer a sense of scale, no ships to promise safe passage. In the early stages of the work, Friedrich had actually painted 2 small sailing ships on the horizon, a tether to humanity and commerce. But as he stepped back and looked at the composition, he realized they were a lie. They offered hope where there should be none. They offered a destination in a painting that was about being lost. With a grim determination, He dipped his brush in the grey-blue mixture and painted them out. The ships vanished beneath the waves of pigment, leaving the ocean empty. Now the canvas was a terrifying abstraction. It was a landscape of the end of the world, but it needed a witness. Friedrich painted a single figure standing on the edge of the dunes. He was a monk dressed in the heavy dark robes of a Capuchin, his head bare to the wind. He did not look at the viewer. He looked out, away from humanity, staring into the thick impenetrable fog. This was the monk by the sea. The figure was tiny, a mere speck of vertical humanity against the horizontal tyranny of the universe. He was not conquering the landscape, he was being swallowed by it. The monk was Friedrich, and he was every man who had ever stood before the ocean and felt the crushing weight of his own insignificance. But Friedrich was not finished. He understood that the abyss had two faces, the infinite space of the sea and the claustrophobic finality of the grave. He placed a second canvas on the easel, the pendant to the monk. If the first painting was about the terror of the void, the second would be about the inevitability of decay. He titled it The Abbey in the Oakwood. Here, the light of day had been extinguished entirely. It was the dead of winter. A thick brown fog choked the air. In the centre rose the ruins of a Gothic church, the very ruins of Eldina that had haunted his sketchbook since his youth in Griefswald. But they were no longer just architecture. They were the skeleton of faith. Surrounding the ruin were gnarled, leafless oak trees, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like frozen lightning. Below, a procession of monks, barely distinguishable from the shadows, carried a coffin through the snow toward the gaping portal of the ruined church. The two paintings sat in his studio like a pair of dark mirrors. One reflected the infinite, the other the finite. Together they formed a narrative of existential suspension. Friedrich worked on them with a feverish intensity, knowing that he was breaking the visual language he had only just established. The Tetschen altar had been a prayer. These paintings were a silence so loud it hurt the ears. In the autumn of 1810, Friedrich sent the pair to the Berlin Academy exhibition. The journey from Dresden to Berlin was a physical one, but the journey the paintings represented was metaphysical. The Berlin art world was different from Dresden. It was sharper, more intellectual, teeming with the writers and philosophers of the Romantic movement. They were hungry for the sublime, but they were unprepared for the brutality of Friedrich's vision. When the exhibition opened, the monk by the sea was hung high on the wall. The public gathered, expecting the usual pleasantries, pastoral scenes, heroic battles, or comfortable mythological allegories. Instead, they were confronted with a wall of blue-black emptiness. Viewers stopped, confused. They squinted, trying to find the focal point. Where was the story? Where was the perspective? The painting seemed to have been cut with shears. It had no beginning and no end. It was less a painting and more a window into a nightmare. People whispered that the artist must be mad. Some laughed nervously, making jokes about the loneliness of the monk. But for the sensitive souls, the poets and the dreamers, the painting acted like a gravitational singularity. It pulled them in. Among the crowd were two giants of German literature, Clemens Brentano and Heinrich von Kleist. They stood before the monk, mesmerized and disturbed. They tried to describe what they were seeing, but words failed them. They collaborated on a review, a piece of writing that would become almost as famous as the painting itself. But it was Kleist who found the words to describe the psychic shock of the image. Kleist wrote of the sensation of looking at the painting, describing it as if one's eyelids had been cut away. He noted the total lack of foreground, the way the earth seemed to crumble beneath the monk's feet. He wrote, "Since in its monotony and boundlessness it has no foreground except the frame, when viewing it, it is as if one's eyelids had been cut off." It was a violent metaphor for a violent viewing experience. Friedrich had forced the viewer to stare unblinkingly into the abyss. There was no comfort, no visual place to rest. The viewer was forced to become the monk standing alone on the precipice, waiting for an answer from a sky that remained terrifyingly silent. The painting was not an object to be admired. It was an experience to be endured. The tension in the exhibition hall was palpable. The critics who had savaged Friedrich during the Hamdor dispute were ready to pounce again, to declare this empty canvas the final proof of his incompetence. How could a painting with nothing in it be art? It was too radical, too stark. It hovered on the edge of total abstraction, a concept that wouldn't exist for another century. Friedrich, back in Dresden, waited for news, the silence of his studio now filled with anxiety. He had wagered everything on the idea that the landscape could represent the interior architecture of the soul. If he failed here in Berlin, he might be finished. Then, a miracle occurred. It did not come from the critics, but from the highest echelons of power. The Crown Prince of Prussia, Friedrich William, a young man with a melancholy disposition and a deep sensitivity to the arts, visited the exhibition. He walked past the grand historical paintings, past the portraits of generals and ladies. He stopped before the monk in the abbey. He saw the darkness, the fog, the tiny, fragile human figures, and he saw himself, the prince who lived in a world of rigid protocol and impending war, understood the isolation of the monk. He understood the mourning of the abbey, against the advice of his more traditional counsellors, who found the works depressing and unfinished. The Crown Prince purchased both paintings. The news travelled back to Dresden like a thunderclap. The future King of Prussia had bought the empty paintings. The validation was absolute. Friedrich had not only survived the scandal, he had conquered the capital. He had proven that art did not need to be busy to be profound. He had shown that a painter could strip away everything, the ships, the trees, the mountains, and still capture the entirety of human experience in a single strip of horizon. But the victory was a heavy one. By painting the monk, Friedrich had crossed a threshold. He had looked too deeply into the void, and the void had entered him. He could not go back to painting pretty valleys or simple ruins. He had touched the sublime, that terrifying mixture of awe and horror, and he was now its servant. As the winter of 1810 set in, Friedrich found himself wandering the banks of the Elbe. The imagery of the monk still burned into his retina. He realized that his life's work would be to act as the interpreter between the visible world and the invisible spirit. He was the monk on the shore. The canvas was his prayer, and the paint was his silence. The monk by the sea and the abbey in the oakwood were crated and shipped to the royal palaces of Berlin, hanging in the halls of power like dark windows into another dimension. They stood as a testament to the courage of a man who dared to paint the unpaintable. But for Friedrich, the acclaim brought a new kind of pressure. He had shown the world the abyss. Now, the world would expect him to guide them through it, again and again. He returned to his easel, the white linen glowing in the dim light of the studio. The sea was behind him now, but the mountains were calling again, not the friendly hills of his youth, but the high, dangerous peaks where the air was thin and the fog concealed treacherous drops. He picked up his palette. The abyss was not just in the ocean, it was everywhere. It was in the jagged rocks, in the morning mist, and in the heart of the artist himself. The infinite void was waiting, and Casper David Friedrich began his ascent. Chapter 5. Patriotic Shadows. The brush as a weapon of war. The silence of the infinite, which had so recently comforted Casper David Friedrich, was shattered not by the crash of waves or the thunder of a mountain storm, but by the rhythmic, terrifying cadence of marching boots. The year was 1812, and the fog that rolled through the streets of Dresden was no longer merely atmospheric. It was the smoke of a continent on fire. Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-proclaimed Emperor of the French, had turned Europe into his personal chessboard, and the German lands were his primary thoroughfare. For Friedrich, a man who sought the divine in the quietude of nature, the intrusion of imperial tyranny was a spiritual violation. The sublime was no longer just a metaphysical concept found in the Rügen chalk cliffs. It had manifested as a historical terror, a colossal force sweeping from the west to crush the soul of his homeland. Friedrich sat in his studio, the sounds of the French occupation filtering through the glass. Dresden, the Florence on the Elbe, had become a garrison town, a depot for the Grand Armée as it prepared for its disastrous march toward Russia. The streets were filled with foreign uniforms, the air thick with the arrogance of conquerors. Most artists of the time retreated into safe allegories or fled to the countryside to paint pastoral denials of reality. But Friedrich, the quiet man from Greifswald, felt a cold, hard rage crystallizing in his chest. He could not wield a musket. His constitution was too fragile, his temperament too melancholic for the chaotic brutality of the trenches. But as he looked at his brushes, arranged like soldiers on his table, he realized he possessed a different kind of arsenal. If the censors forbade spoken dissent, and the French police monitored the printing presses, Friedrich would speak in the language of trees, ice, and stone. He would turn the landscape itself into a partisan. This marked the beginning of a transformation in Friedrich's art, a shift from the universal to the specifically nationalistic, yet executed with such cryptic sophistication that it baffled the occupiers. He began to encode his canvases with a secret symbology of resistance, a visual language understood only by those whose hearts burned for German liberation. The oak tree, gnarled and ancient, became the defiant symbol of the German people, weathered, battered, but deeply rooted and unbreakable. The spruce, evergreen and sharp, stood for the hope of resurrection. And the ruins he painted were no longer just memento mori for the human condition. They were the specific graves of Germanic history, waiting to be avenged. The most striking declaration of this silent war came with the painting The Chasseur in the Forest. On the surface it appeared to be a simple winter scene. A French dragoon, a chasseur, stands alone at the edge of a dense, towering German fir forest. But under Friedrich's hand the scene transforms into a death sentence. The soldier, usually depicted in art as a glorious conqueror, is rendered insignificant, a tiny lost doll swallowed by the majesty of the Teutonic woods. He's turned away from the viewer, motionless, paralyzed by the silence of a nature that refuses to yield to him. The trees stand like a phalanx of dark sentinels barring his path, an impenetrable wall of German identity that no artillery can breach. Perched on a stump nearby, a raven, the bird of doom, the messenger of death, watches him. It is singing the soldier's eulogy before he has even fallen. Friedrich had painted the French Empire not as a victor, but as a lost child wandering into a dark, freezing trap. It was a devastating psychological counterattack, framing the invader as irrelevant against the eternal timeline of the land they sought to conquer. As the months dragged on and the news of Napoleon's catastrophic retreat from Moscow began to filter back to Dresden, Friedrich's studio became a quiet hub of patriotic fervour. He was not alone in his intense nationalism. He corresponded with poets and thinkers like Ernst Moritz Arndt and Theodor Körner, men who were using words to ignite the fires of rebellion just as Friedrich used paint. Körner, a young, dashing poet who would eventually die in battle, became a tragic muse for the movement. Friedrich, unable to join the Lützow Free Corps, the volunteer paramilitary units fighting the French, did the only thing he could. He funded the equipment for those who could fight. He poured his meagre earnings into the war effort, buying saddles and sabres for friends, stripping his own life down to the barest necessities. This period was defined by a suffocating tension. Friedrich moved through Dresden like a ghost, his eyes scanning the horizon not for aesthetic inspiration, but for the signal fires of liberation. He began to paint figures wearing the Altdeutsche Tracht, the old German dress. This archaic style of clothing, consisting of long coats and velvet berets, was illegal in many occupied territories. It was the uniform of the radical students and the freedom fighters, a sartorial rejection of French fashion and a callback to the perceived purity of the Middle Ages. By placing figures in this dress within his landscapes, Friedrich was populating his painted world with rebels. In The Cross in the Mountains, and later in Tombs of the Old Heroes, He merged religious piety with national fanaticism. The tombs bore the names of Germanic heroes like Arminius, who had slaughtered the Roman legions centuries prior. The message was clear. The French are the new Romans, and they will meet the same fate in the Teutonic mud. The war came to a head in 1813 with the Battle of Nations at Leipzig, a clash of such magnitude that the ground shook for miles. Friedrich, waiting in the wings, watched as the tide turned. The French were routed. The dream of a liberated, unified Germany seemed within reach. The euphoria that washed over the German lands was unlike anything Friedrich had ever experienced. It was a vindication of his visions. The fog was lifting, and the sun was rising over a free people. He envisioned a new era where the spirit of the people, forged in the fires of war and rooted in the sacred landscape, would build a society based on liberty and brotherhood. But the tragedy of the romantic spirit is that reality rarely accommodates its ideals. The victory over Napoleon did not bring the freedom Friedrich and his patriots had dreamed of. Instead, the Congress of Vienna reassembled the broken map of Europe and handed power back to the conservative monarchies. The kings and princes returned to their thrones, terrified of the very nationalism that had saved them. The old German dress was banned. The student groups were suppressed. The censorship returned, this time not from the French, but from the German authorities themselves. Friedrich, who had painted the soul of the resistance, found himself viewed with suspicion by the restored order. He was branded a demagogue, a radical whose brooding, intense art was seen as dangerous to the stability of the state. The betrayal cut Friedrich deeper than the occupation ever had. He had looked into the abyss of war and found courage, only to be stabbed in the back by the peace. The patriotic fire that had warmed his icy landscapes began to cool into a bitter, hardened melancholy. He realized that the Germany he had painted, that spiritual unified entity, existed only on his canvas. In the real world it was fractured, bureaucratic, and oppressive. He retreated once more. The political figures in his paintings turned their backs on the viewer even more resolutely, staring into voids that offered no answers. The hope of 1813 dissolved into the reactionary gloom of the Restoration era. Friedrich's brush, which had acted as a weapon of war, now became a tool of mourning. He began to paint the aftermath, destroyed churches, desolate graveyards, and ships sailing into ominous dark harbours. One painting from this disillusionment stands out: the Sea of Ice, also known as the Wreck of Hope. Though painted later, its emotional roots lay in this betrayal. It depicts a ship crushed by relentless, jagged slabs of ice nature, indifferent to human endeavour, grinding man's ambitions into splinters. It was a visual metaphor for the fate of the German reform movement. The ice was the cold, hard reality of political power, and the ship was the fragile dream of freedom. As 1815 approached, Friedrich was a hero to a cause that had been outlawed. He was a celebrated artist whose most passionate works were now politically suspect. The adrenaline of the war years faded, leaving behind a profound silence. But it was in this silence that Friedrich would find his second wind. The patriot had been defeated, but the mystic remained. The mountains were still there, the fog still clung to the valleys, and the moon still rose over the ruins. If he could not change the world with his art, he would document its transient, tragic beauty. He had survived the War of Nations, but the war for his own soul, the struggle against the encroaching darkness of his own mind, was just beginning. He turned his back on the palaces of Berlin and Dresden, looked toward the grey horizon of the Baltic, and prepared to walk alone into the mist once more. Chapter 6. A Late Bloom. Love, Marriage, and the Chalk Cliffs. The year was 1816, and in the damp, high-ceilinged studios of Dresden, Casper David Friedrich had solidified a reputation that bordered on myth. To his contemporaries, he was the monk of the Elbe, a man who seemed to have emerged from the very mist he painted, silent, melancholic, and utterly impenetrable. He was 43 years old, an age that, in the early 19th century, signalled the solidifying of a man's habits and the closing of doors. He was a confirmed bachelor, living in a sparse, austere apartment that resembled a monastic cell more than a home. Visitors described an eerie stillness in his rooms, where the only clutter was a collection of dried weeds, stones, and sketches of dead oak trees. He had spent decades staring into the abyss of nature, seemingly content to let the abyss stare back, unblinkingly, until he dissolved into it. The world expected him to fade into an eccentric old age, painting darker and darker graveyards until he occupied one himself. But the narrative of Casper David Friedrich is rarely one of straight lines. Just as the fog in his paintings often parts to reveal a startling jagged peak, his life was about to fracture in the most unexpected way. In the quiet hum of Dresden society, a rumour began to circulate a whisper so unlikely that his closest friends initially dismissed it as a misunderstanding. The solitary mystic, the man whose soul was wedded to the cold North Sea and the silent moon, had fallen in love. The object of this sudden, late-blooming affection was Caroline Bommer. She was 25 years old, nearly 2 decades his junior, and in almost every conceivable way, she was the antithesis of the brooding artist. The daughter of a simple dyer, Caroline was not a philosopher or a poet. She was vibrant, practical, and painfully human. She did not speak in riddles or spend her days contemplating the metaphysics of death. She brought with her the scent of fresh linens and the chatter of the marketplace, noise and colour invading the grey sanctuary of Friedrich's life. For a man who had spent a lifetime meticulously constructing walls of solitude, her arrival was a seismic event. It was a mystery that baffled his intellectual circle. What did the painter of the infinite see in the dyer's daughter? And perhaps more pressingly, what did a young, lively woman see in the taciturn, depressive painter? The answer lay in a hidden corner of Friedrich's psyche that few had ever seen, a deep, aching desire for connection that had been buried under layers of traumatic loss and philosophical detachment. On January 23rd, 1818, in a ceremony as understated as his landscapes, they were married. The wedding took place at 7 in the morning, a peculiar time chosen to avoid spectacle under the cold light of a winter sunrise. Friedrich, ever the master of his own narrative, wrote to his brother shortly after, acknowledging the shock his marriage would cause. I'm not surprised, he wrote, that you are surprised. He described his decision not as a surrender to convention, but as a necessary evolution, a way to anchor his drifting soul before it floated away entirely. He spoke of building a hut for himself, a domestic shelter against the cosmic winds he had spent so long documenting. This union marked the beginning of the most radiant summer of Friedrich's life. For a brief, shimmering moment, the heavy clouds that typically suffocated his canvases lifted. To celebrate their union, Friedrich took Caroline on a journey not to the grand cities of Europe or the ruins of Italy, but north, back to the source of his genius. They travelled to the island of Rügen, the rugged, windswept jewel of the Baltic Sea. This was Friedrich's spiritual home, the place of his childhood summers, but this time he was not walking the shoreline as a solitary ghost. He was seeing it through the eyes of a husband. The honeymoon of 1818 produced a flurry of sketches and observations, but it culminated in one of the most celebrated and enigmatic paintings of the Romantic era, Chalk Cliffs on Rügen. At first glance, the painting appears to be a straightforward travelogue, a scenic view of the famous Victoria viewpoint. But beneath the bright colours and the stunning verticality lies a complex psychological puzzle, a code hidden within the chalk and foliage. The composition is striking, framed by a heart-shaped opening formed by the dark, overarching branches of 2 trees. This is no accident. It is a visual declaration of love, a framing device that turns the dangerous drop of the cliffs into a window of intimacy. Through this verdant heart, we see the blinding white of the chalk cliffs plunging down into a sea that is not dark and ominous, but a brilliant turquoise jewel, shimmering with a light that feels almost tropical compared to his usual palette. But the suspense of the painting lies in the figures. There are 3 of them, perched precariously on the edge of the precipice. On the right stands a man, arms folded against a tree trunk, gazing out at the horizon with a stoic, fearless demeanour. He wears the old German costume, the symbol of the patriot. This is widely believed to be a double portrait Friedrich's brother Christian, or perhaps the idealized version of Friedrich himself. On the left sits a woman in a striking red dress, gesturing toward the abyss, her face flushed with life. This is Caroline. She is the anchor, the vibrant splash of colour in a world of white and blue, the symbol of the life force that has entered the artist-heir's world. And then there is the third figure. In the centre, dangerously close to the edge, a man has fallen to his knees. He has discarded his hat and is leaning forward, peering terrified and awestruck into the deep chasm below. This is the true Friedrich the artist, the mystic, the man who knows that beneath the beauty of the marriage and the brightness of the sea, the abyss is still, waiting. While the others look out or point, he looks down. It is a moment of profound vulnerability captured in oil. He is acknowledging that even in the midst of his greatest happiness, he remains acutely aware of the precipice. The white cliffs are beautiful, but they are also jagged, unstable, and deadly. The drop is fatal. The painting is a tension wire stretched between the joy of his new life and the vertigo of his old fears. Yet, the darkness does not win. Not this time. The marriage transformed his art in subtle, profound ways. The rooken figure, the figure seen from behind, changed. Where once a single traveller stood alone against a void of fog, now figures began to appear in pairs. They held hands. They leaned on one another. In works like On the Sailing Boat, painted shortly after the honeymoon, we see a man and a woman sitting together in the prow of a ship, heading toward a city on the horizon. The ship is no longer the doomed vessel of the sea of ice, crushed by frozen indifference. It is a vessel of hope, moving in harmony with the wind. The horizon is no longer a barrier, but a destination. For a few short years, the monk allowed himself to be a man. The studio in Dresden, once a tomb of silence, became a place of domestic softness. Carolina's presence acted as a filter, softening the harsh northern light that Friedrich had always favoured. He painted women looking out of windows, their interiors warm and safe, looking at the world but separated from its harshness. He found a rhythm in the domesticity that he had previously scorned. He was happy. But in the world of Casper David Friedrich, happiness is never a permanent state. It is merely a break in the clouds. The suspense of his narrative comes from the knowledge that the fog always returns. The late bloom of 1818 was genuine, a period of lush emotional growth that produced some of his most iconic and accessible masterpieces. He had proven to himself that he could love and be loved, that he could exist within the human sphere without losing his connection to the divine. But the cliffs of Rügen are made of chalk, soft, eroding and transient. They crumble under the beat of the waves. As the decade turned and the 1820s approached, the vibrant turquoise of the Baltic would slowly begin to fade from his palette. The political climate of Germany was hardening, the suppression of liberty returning with a vengeance, and the artist's own health began to show the first hairline cracks of decay. The joy of the honeymoon would sustain him for a time, but the shadows were lengthening once again. Friedrich had walked away from the precipice, hand in hand with Caroline, but he had not forgotten what he saw in the deep white chasm. The mystic was dormant, lulled by the warmth of the hearth, but he was not gone. And as the seasons turned, the cold wind began to rattle the window panes of his happy home, whispering that the winter was far from over. The bloom was beautiful, but it was late, and the frost was already gathering in the corners of the frame. Chapter 7. The Summit of Solitude. The Wanderer Above the Mist. The year 1818 was a paradox in the life of Casper David Friedrich, a year where the sunlight of his new domestic life fought a silent war against the encroaching shadows of his psyche. While he was painting the intimate hand-holding figures of the chalk cliffs, another image was forming in the crucible of his mind, an image that would become the defining avatar of the Romantic era and the ultimate symbol of the solitary soul. This was not a celebration of union, like his wedding works, but a stark, majestic return to the self. He had descended from the altar. He had walked the bright shores of Rügen, but now the artist felt the magnetic pull of the heights. The domestic hearth was warm, but Friedrich knew that truth, the kind that seared the soul and terrified the mind, was only found where the air was thin and the ground treacherous. He retreated into his studio in Dresden, a space that was becoming less of a room and more of a fortress against the mundane. Here, amidst the smell of turpentine and the dust of charcoal, Friedrich began to construct a mountain that did not exist. This is the great secret of the wanderer above the sea of fog. It is a lie that tells the truth. The mountain beneath the wanderer's boots is not a single geographical location, but a Frankenstein-esque monster of geology. He took the craggy rock formation of the Gamrig, the slopes of the Kaiserkron, and the distant majesty of the Zirkelstein, and he stitched them together on the canvas. He was playing God with the geography of Saxony, rearranging the heavy granite furniture of the earth to suit the architecture of his own spirit. As the painting took form, a figure emerged from the void of the canvas. He stands with his back to us, the ultimate Rücken figure, a device Friedrich had used before, but never with such confrontational power. In previous works, the figures were often small, overwhelmed by the canopy of trees or the vastness of the ocean. They were spectators. This man is different. He dominates the centre of the frame. He stands at the apex of the world, one foot propped casually, almost arrogantly on the jagged summit. He is not cowering before nature. He is communing with it as an equal, or perhaps as a conqueror who has realized that his conquest is made of vapor. But to understand the suspense that radiates from this canvas, one must look past the mist and focus on the man's clothing. This is where the documentary truth of Friedrich's life takes a turn into the political intrigue of 19th century Germany. The wanderer is not wearing hiking clothes. He is dressed in the Altdeutsche Tracht, the old German costume. It consists of a dark green velvet frock coat, a wide collar, and loose trousers. To the modern eye, it looks merely period-appropriate, archaic and formal. But in 1818, this coat was a scream of rebellion. This attire had been adopted by the volunteer corps who fought against Napoleon, and later by the radical student fraternities, the Burschenschaften, who demanded a unified democratic Germany. They were the enemies of the conservative restoration, the young firebrands who wanted to burn down the old monarchies and build a republic of liberty. By dressing his wanderer in this uniform, Friedrich was making a dangerous statement. The political climate was rapidly freezing over. The utter defeat of Napoleon had not brought freedom. It had brought the restoration of the old repressive order. Metternicher's spies were everywhere. To wear the Altdeutsche Tracht was to mark oneself as a dissident, a demagogue, a suspect of the state. Friedrich, the quiet man of the studio, was friends with these radicals. He was harbouring the spirit of revolution in paint. The wanderer stands above the fog, and the fog represents the murky, confusing and suffocating reality of the political world below. He has risen above the petty tyrannies of kings and borders to breathe the air of pure liberty, but the suspense lies in the precariousness of his position. Just a year after this painting was completed, the reactionary forces would strike back. The Carlsbad decrees of 1819 would ban the student fraternities, censor the press, and outlaw this very style of dress. Friedrich was painting a manifesto just as the Iron Curtain of censorship was about to fall. He was immortalizing a hero who was about to be hunted. There is a haunting ambiguity about the identity of the man on the cliff. Some art historians argue it is a self-portrait, a depiction of Friedrich's own red-haired desire for the infinite. Others suggest it is a tribute to a fallen friend, perhaps a high-ranking forestry official like Colonel Friedrich Gotthard von Brincken. who had died shortly before the painting was realized. If it is a memorial, the silence of the painting deepens. It becomes a conversation between the living and the dead, a man looking out not into a landscape but into the afterlife, into the great white unknown that swallows us all. The composition itself is designed to unsettle the viewer. We are hovering in mid-air, suspended directly behind the wanderer, without a foothold of our own. We are forced to inhabit his perspective, yet we are denied his face. We cannot see if he is weeping, smiling, or staring in terror. We are forced to project our own emotions onto the blank canvas of his back. This is Friedrich's masterstroke of psychological manipulation. He denies us the specific emotion of the subject so that we must confront the universal emotion of the situation. We are alone, we are small, we are standing on the edge of a precipice, and the world before us is shifting, unknowable, and dangerously beautiful. The sea of fog is not merely a meteorological phenomenon. It is the externalization of the human condition as Friedrich saw it. The mist hides as much as it reveals. Peaks pierce through the white blanket like islands in a drowning world, suggesting that what we see of reality is only a fraction of the truth. The rest is submerged, hidden, lost. For a man like Friedrich, who suffered from bouts of crushing depression, the fog was a familiar companion. It was the grey noise of the mind, the obscuring veil that made clarity impossible. The wanderer has climbed above it, yes, but he hasn't escaped it. It laps at his feet, it surrounds him. He is the master of the summit, but he is the prisoner of the view. As the 1810s bled into the 1820s, the reception of this masterpiece was as cool and misty as the subject matter. The art establishment, which favoured the clear, narrative storytelling of history paintings or the idealised landscapes of the classicists, didn't know what to do with a man standing on a rock doing nothing. Where was the story? Where was the moral lesson? Where was the mythological reference? Friedrich offered none. He offered only existence. The painting was a mirror, and many critics found the reflection too stark, too lonely. They wanted a window into a pretty world. Friedrich gave them a door into the void. The creation of this work marked the zenith of Friedrich's confidence, the moment where his technical skill and his philosophical vision were perfectly aligned. But the title of this chapter in his life, The Summit of Solitude, carries a double meaning. To reach the summit is a triumph, but to remain there is impossible. You cannot live on the peak. You must descend. And for Friedrich, the descent was beginning even as he applied the final glaze of oil to the canvas. The political noose was tightening. In 1819, the writer August von Kotzebue was assassinated by a radical student, providing the Austrian and Prussian governments the excuse they needed to crush the liberal movement. The friends Friedrich cherished, the intellectuals and patriots who visited his studio, came under intense scrutiny. Ernst Moritz Arndt, a close associate and nationalist poet, was suspended from his university post. The demagogue persecution had begun. The Altdeutsche Tracht, worn by the wanderer, was officially banned. Friedrich's silent protest, his visual anthem of freedom, was now illegal in the streets of Dresden. The artist retreated further. The summit of solitude ceased to be a metaphor for spiritual elevation and began to resemble a prison cell. The paranoia of the state infiltrated the art world. Friedrich, known for his Teutonic and patriotic themes, found himself viewed with suspicion by the conservatives and ridiculed by the new generation of realists who found his mysticism outdated. The fog he painted was seeping out of the frame and into his career. In the quiet of his studio, the happy husband of 1818 began to wrestle once again with the monk of his earlier years. The duality that defined him, the tension between the warmth of life and the coldness of eternity, was becoming unbalanced. The wanderer stands firm on his rock, steady and composed, but Friedrich was beginning to sway. The hairline cracks in his health, previously ignored during the euphoria of his marriage, began to widen. A subtle tremor in the hand, a darker mood in the mornings, a sense that the golden light of the honeymoon was being filtered through a heavier atmosphere. The painting remains a frozen moment of perfect tension, the wanderer suspended forever between the solid rock and the shifting air, between the finite and the infinite. But the man who painted him was moving through time, and time was not kind. The late bloom had produced a fruit of spectacular haunting beauty, but the season was turning. The bright greens and blues that had punctuated his work during the Rugen period were about to be swallowed by the greys, the violets, and the deep, impenetrable blacks of his later years. Friedrich had climbed the mountain. He had looked out over the sea of fog and captured the sublime indifference of nature. He had placed humanity at the centre of the universe, only to show how small we truly are. But as he put down his brushes and looked at the figure he had created, this man who would never turn around, who would never tell us what he sees, Friedrich must have felt the chill of the altitude. The summit is a lonely place. There is nowhere to go but down, and down in the valley the shadows were waiting, long and cold, ready to welcome the wanderer home. The mystery of the painting is not who the man is, but what happens next. Does he turn back to the safety of the path? Does he step off into the mist? Or does he stand there until he turns to stone, becoming just another peak in the range, another monument to the silence? Friedrich offered no answer. He simply left us there, on the edge, with the wind in our ears and the fog rising to meet us, while he quietly packed away his paints and prepared for the coming storm. The political winter was here, and the inner winter was following close behind. The bloom was over. The erosion had begun. Chapter 8. The Wreck of Hope. Frozen Dreams in the Arctic Sea. If the view from the mountaintop in The Wanderer was a gasp of awe, what followed was a held breath that turned into a suffocation. The altitude had been dizzying, placing a man above the clouds, master of all he surveyed. But gravity is a relentless law, both in physics and in the trajectory of a career. By the early 1820s, the air in Dresden had changed. The political optimism that had fueled the fires of German Romanticism was being systematically extinguished by the damp, heavy blanket of the Restoration. The censorship laws were tightening, the radical students were being silenced, and the dream of a liberated, unified land was freezing over. Casper David Friedrich, sensitive as a barometer to the unseen pressures of the world, felt this chill in his bones. He retreated from the heights. He came down from the mountain and walked straight into the abyss of the north. The year was 1823. Friedrich was nearly 50 years old. The golden light of his marriage had settled into a domestic routine, and while he was now a professor at the academy, it was a title without power, a position that felt more like a consolation prize than a triumph. He was beginning to be seen as an eccentric, a relic of a passionate era that the Biedermeier public was eager to forget in favour of comfort and stability. But Friedrich did not seek comfort. He sought the truth of the sublime, and his mind had drifted far from the lush forests and moonlit harbours. His imagination had been captured by the accounts of William Parry, the British explorer seeking the Northwest Passage. Parry's ships, the Hecla and the Griper, had ventured into the white void of the Arctic, battling elemental forces that made the Napoleonic Wars look like the squabbles of children. Friedrich had never seen the Arctic. He had never felt the bite of polar wind or seen the sun circle the horizon without setting. But he had seen the Elbe River freeze. During the harsh winter of 1820-1821, the great artery of Dresden had choked with ice. Friedrich had gone down to the banks, shivering in his coat, sketching the violence of the river. He studied how the ice floes collided, how they buckled and screamed as they were forced upward by the crushing weight of the water. He saw the geometry of destruction in those shards. He took these oil studies back to his studio, and in the quiet gloom of his workspace, he transmuted the local river into the end of the world. The result was the Sea of Ice, a painting that stands as the grim inverted twin of the Wanderer above the Sea of Fog. If the Wanderer was about the domination of the human spirit, the Sea of Ice is about its utter annihilation. As the canvas was unveiled, The silence in the room was not one of reverence, but of confusion and dread. The viewer is confronted with a scene of chaotic devastation. In the foreground, jagged slabs of ice, painted in dirty browns, creams, and terrifyingly cold blues, jut into the sky like the tombstones of a giant's graveyard. These are not the soft, snow-covered hills of a Christmas card. They are sharp, weaponized shards of geology. The composition is pyramidal, mimicking the mountains he once loved. But this is a mountain built of debris. It is a monument to a crash. And there, barely visible, crushed beneath the weight of the piled ice on the right side of the composition, lies the wreckage of a ship. It is the HMS Griper, though in Friedrich's vision it serves as a universal vessel. The ship has been capsized, swallowed by the frozen ocean. Its wooden ribs are splintered, its masts snapped like dry twigs. The puny construct of human engineering, the vessel of exploration, of commerce, of empire, has been casually chewed up and spat out by an indifferent nature. There is no tragedy here in the theatrical sense, because there is no audience within the painting. There are no survivors clinging to the wreckage, waving for help. There is no dramatic lighting suggesting a divine rescue. There is only the ice, the silence, and the pale, washed-out blue of a sky that does not care. This was the wreck of hope. The painting was originally catalogued with a longer, more descriptive title referencing the expeditions, but it soon acquired this moniker, and it fit perfectly. It was the wreck of the Enlightenment idea that man could conquer nature. It was the wreck of the political hope that Germany could be free, and largely unbeknownst to Friedrich at the moment of its creation, it was the wreck of his own commercial success. When Friedrich displayed the work at the Prague Academy exhibition in 1824, the reaction was catastrophic. The art world was moving on, the Dusseldorf school was rising, championing realism, theatrical narratives, and sentimental landscapes that flattered the viewer. They wanted clear stories, heroic deeds, or charming vistas. Friedrich gave them a broken ship in a freezer. Critics were baffled. They called the painting incoherent. One critic famously dismissed it as looking like a clumsy plate of broken ice. They could not understand why an artist would devote such scale and detail to a scene of pure desolation. They missed the point entirely. The desolation was the point. The rejection of the sea of ice marked a pivotal, painful turning point in Friedrich's narrative. Up until this moment he had been controversial but respected. Now he was beginning to be viewed as obsolete, a man shouting into a storm that no one else wanted to acknowledge. The painting remained unsold. It sat in his studio, a constant, frozen reminder of his failure to connect with the shifting tastes of the time. He eventually had to sell it for a pittance, a humiliating end for a work he had poured his intellectual soul into. But looking at it now, through the lens of history, the painting vibrates with a terrifying prescience. Friedrich had captured the essence of the sublime in its most hostile form. This was not the beautiful sublime of a sunset. This was the terrifying sublime of extinction. The ice slabs in the centre of the painting reach upward, striving toward heaven, but they are blocked. They are static. It is a crystallized striving, a prayer frozen in the throat. The colours are particularly unsettling. Friedrich eschewed the pure whites one might expect from a snowscape. Instead, he used ochres, earth tones and violets, blending the ice with the mud of the earth, suggesting that this frozen wasteland is not a celestial realm, but a very earthly grave. The narrative of the painting suggests a passage of time that has ended. The ship came, it struggled, and it lost. Now the ice has settled. The violence of the impact is over, replaced by the eternal stillness of the aftermath. This is what haunted the viewers of 1824, even if they couldn't articulate it. It was a memento mori on a geological scale. It whispered that all our endeavours, all our politics, all our art would eventually be crushed by the slow, grinding mechanics of the universe. For Friedrich, the inner winter mentioned by his friends was beginning to manifest in his brushstrokes. The playfulness of his earlier years, the gentle melancholy of his harbour scenes, was hardening into something brittle. He was retreating further into himself. The failure of the Sea of Ice confirmed his suspicions about the public. They were blind. They wanted pretty lies, not hard truths. He became more reclusive, his letters more bitter. The solitude he had once courted as a muse was now becoming a prison cell. In the years following this masterpiece, Friedrich's health began to waver. The strong legs that had carried him across the Riesengebirge mountains began to weaken. The steady hand that had painted the finest rigging on the smallest ships began to tremble. The Sea of Ice stood as a prophecy of his own trajectory. He was the ship, listing to the side, trapped by forces he could not control: the changing art market, the repressive government, his own aging body. Yet, there is a strange, hypnotic beauty in the wreckage. The painting compels us to look. We are drawn to the texture of the ice, the translucence of the shards, the way the light hits the jagged edges. Even in destruction, Friedrich found perfection. He showed us that the world does not need us to be beautiful. The Arctic existed for eons before the Griper arrived, and it would exist for eons after the wood rotted away. It was a humbling, terrifying vision of deep time. As the 1820s wore on, the ice of that painting seemed to seep into the rest of his life. The patrons stopped calling, the students stopped coming. The late bloom had indeed passed, and the petals had fallen, leaving only the naked, thorny branches exposed to the cold. Friedrich continued to paint. Of course he could do nothing else, but the grand, theatrical ambition of the Sea of Ice was never repeated. He retreated into smaller formats, into sepia, into the shadows. The painting remains one of the most powerful images of the Romantic era, because it refuses to offer comfort. In The Wanderer, we could imagine ourselves as the man on the cliff, conquering the view. In the Sea of Ice, there is no place for us to stand. To step into this painting is to die. It is a no-entry sign, painted by nature itself. Friedrich had looked into the white abyss, and he blinked. Not out of fear, but out of resignation. He understood now that the summit was not the end of the journey. The end of the journey was down here, in the crushing silence, where hope is wrecked and frozen, preserved forever in the cold, hard light of truth. The erosion was no longer just a metaphor. It was the reality of his days. The storm he had prepared for had arrived, and it was quieter and colder than he had ever imagined. The ice was closing in. Chapter 9. The Fading Light. Sepia shadows and the first stroke. By the late 1820s, the silence in the studio on the Elbe had changed texture. It was no longer the pregnant, meditative silence of a mystic waiting for a vision. It was the heavy, dusty silence of a room that the world had simply forgotten to visit. The acclaim that had once greeted Friedrich, the letters from Goethe, the purchases by the Prussian crown, the eager students hanging on his every cryptic word, had evaporated like mist in the midday sun. The artistic climate of Germany was shifting violently under his feet. A new generation had arrived, centred in Dusseldorf, championing a style of realism that was theatrical, narrative, and socially engaged. They wanted stories, clear morals, and bright legible details. Friedrich, with his fog-bound cliffs and lonely backs turned to the viewer, suddenly looked like a relic of a bygone superstition. He was becoming a ghost in his own time, haunting the academy that refused to fully embrace him. The indignities began to pile up, small and sharp as shards of ice. In 1824, the chair of landscape painting at the Dresden Academy had become vacant. Friedrich, then 50 years old and arguably the most famous landscape painter in Northern Europe, expected the appointment. It was the logical culmination of his life's work, a guarantee of financial stability and status. Instead, the position was left unfilled. The establishment decided that his art was too peculiar, too melancholic to be taught to the impressionable youth. They gave him an associate professorship, a consolation prize that came with a meagre salary, and the unspoken message that his particular way of seeing was a dead end. The rejection gnawed at him. He became more reclusive, his famously prickly temperament sharpening into paranoia. He began to see enemies in the shadows of the pillars, critics in the rustling of the trees, and yet as the external light of fame dimmed, the internal light, that strange, cool luminescence that defined his genius, flared up for one final, magnificent struggle against the dying of the day. This period, often dismissed by his contemporaries as the beginning of his senility, produced works of such haunting, ethereal beauty that they seem less like paintings and more like farewell notes written in oil. The most poignant of these is The Stages of Life. Painted around 1834, it is perhaps his only true self-portrait, though his face, as always, remains turned away. The canvas depicts a shoreline at twilight, bathed in a ghostly violet glow. 5 ships sail on a calm sea, each at a different distance from the shore, representing the stages of human existence. On the beach, 5 figures correspond to the vessels. There is a young boy holding up a Swedish flag, a nod to Friedrich's roots in Greifswald, a young girl, a young woman, a man in his prime, and finally, an old man in a fur hat and heavy coat, walking with a stick, his back to us, moving towards the water. This old man is Friedrich himself. He's no longer the hiker standing atop the peaks. He's the weary traveller at sea level, preparing to board the boat that waits on the horizon. The painting is heartbreakingly personal. The children are his own, his son Gustav Adolf, his daughters Agnes Adelheid and Emma, and the man in the top hat is his nephew Johann. It is a family portrait staged at the edge of eternity. The atmosphere is not one of terror, but of a profound, aching acceptance. The sun is setting, the sails are slack, and the tide is ready to take him out. But nature, the cruel muse he had worshipped for decades, had one final, devastating correction to make. The decline was not just professional, it was visceral. Friedrich had always been a man of the mind, but his art required the steady hand of a craftsman. He relied on the precision of his fine brushes to render the rigging of a ship, or the skeletal delicacy of a winter oak. He needed his eyes to pierce the gloom. The summer of 1835 was stiflingly hot in Dresden. The air was thick and still, pressing down on the city like a woolen blanket. On June 26th, the storm he had painted so often finally broke, but it did not happen in the sky. It happened within the fragile vessels of his own brain. Friedrich suffered a massive stroke. It struck him down with the violence of a falling tree, leaving him paralysed and gasping on the floor of that quiet studio. When he awoke, the world had changed irrevocably. The apoplectic stroke, as it was known, had ravaged his motor skills. His limbs were heavy, unresponsive, dead weights attached to a mind that was still terrifyingly alive. For a man whose entire existence was defined by the translation of spiritual vision into physical strokes of paint, this was a living death. The doctors came with their leeches and their cures, sending him to the spa town of Teplitz to recover, but the damage was catastrophic. The hand that had painted the monk by the sea could no longer hold a brush steady enough for oil painting. The smell of turpentine, once the perfume of his sanctuary, became a reminder of what he had lost. The large canvases were rolled up and put away. The easel stood empty, like a skeleton in the corner of the room. However, the creative drive is a stubborn beast. It does not die until the heart stops. Friedrich returned to Dresden, broken but not extinguished. If he could not paint with the heavy, demanding oils, he would find another way. He retreated into sepia. He took up watercolour and pencils, media that were lighter, more forgiving, yet capable of profound depth. This enforced change in medium altered his vision once again. Deprived of colour, his world became a place of shadows and stark contrasts, a twilight realm of browns, greys, and blacks. These late sepia drawings are the stuff of nightmares and revelations, They are stripped of the romantic grandeur of his earlier years. There are no more travellers conquering mountains. Instead, there are owls. He became obsessed with the image of the owl perched on a spade, sitting atop a fresh grave. In Owl on a Grave, the bird stares out at the viewer with wide yellow eyes, a sentinel of the underworld against a full moon. It is a symbol of wisdom, yes, but also of the night, of the predator that sees what is hidden in the dark. The grave is open, the message is clear. Friedrich was looking into the hole he knew was waiting for him. Other drawings from this period show solitary coffins resting in desolate landscapes, or coastal scenes where the fog is so thick it obliterates the horizon entirely. This was the sepia shadow that fell over his life. The stroke had severed his connection to the vibrant, living world of colour, trapping him in a monochromatic borderland. Yet, even here, in the debris of his health, he found a terrible kind of truth. The lack of colour forced a focus on structure, on the bones of the earth, on the stark geometry of death. The tragedy of these final years was compounded by his isolation. The Crown Prince of Prussia, once his greatest patron, visited him in 183, finding the old master frail and impoverished. He bought a few small works, an act of charity more than connoisseurship. Friedrich reportedly wept not out of gratitude, but out of shame. He knew he was a charity case. The first stroke had taken his hand. The indifference of the world was taking his dignity. As the 1830s bled toward their conclusion, Friedrich spent his days sitting at the window of his apartment. He would watch the river Elbe flow past, the same river he had painted 1,000 times. He watched the clouds dismantle themselves and reform, the light shifting from the gold of morning to the blue of dusk. He could see it all. The great book of nature was still open before him, but he could no longer transcribe it. He was a prophet who had lost his voice, a captain whose ship was becalmed in a frozen sea of his own making. The no-entry sign he had painted in the sea of ice had become the reality of his daily existence. He was locked out of his own art. The sepia ink dried on the paper, dark and final like dried blood. The light was fading fast now, and the shadows in the corner of the room were beginning to take the shape of waiting things. Chapter 10. Forgotten in the Grave. The Erasure of a Master. On May 7th, 1840, the view from the window finally went dark. The great book of nature that Casper David Friedrich had spent a lifetime transcribing slammed shut. The end did not come with the dramatic thunder of his mountain storms or the sublime terror of his shipwrecks. It arrived with the quiet, suffocating banality of dropsy and general decay. He died in Dresden, the city that had once hailed him as a visionary, but in the room where he took his final breath, the air was thick with the silence of a man who had already been left behind. He was 65 years old, half paralysed, and virtually destitute. The burial at the Trinity Cemetery was a sombre, sparsely attended affair. There were no grand processions of state, no weeping crowds of acolytes. The candles that flickered in the wind were few. His friend, the painter Carl Gustav Carus, stood by the grave, one of the last links to the golden era when Friedrich S.'s name had been whispered with awe in the courts of Berlin and St. Petersburg. But even Carus, who had once written philosophical treatises alongside Friedrich, had begun to drift away, his tastes aligning with a world that was rapidly losing patience with mysticism. As the earth was shoveled over the coffin, it wasn't just a body being buried. It was an entire way of seeing the world. The mist was lifting, and in the harsh light of the mid-19th century there was no place left for ghosts. What followed was a dismantling so thorough it felt like an execution. The contents of his studio, the sacred laboratory where he had conjured the monk by the sea and the abbey in the oak wood, were catalogued and sold off like the scraps of a bankrupt merchant. The auction was a tragedy of valuation. Masterpieces that are today considered priceless icons of the German soul were knocked down for thalers, the equivalent of pocket change. His family, left in precarious financial straits, watched as the canvases were carried away, not to museums or palaces, but often to the dusty back rooms of indifferent relatives or minor collectors who viewed them as curiosities rather than art. The erasure was swift. In the decades following his death, the art world underwent a seismic shift. The romantic obsession with the infinite, the soul, and the terrifying beauty of God in nature was suddenly deemed embarrassed, old-fashioned, and even pathological. The Biedermeier era had fully arrived, demanding comfort, clarity, and domestic order. Then came realism, with its obsession for social facts and material truth. Friedrich S. fog-drenched landscapes, with their turned-away figures and brooding silences, were seen as the products of a diseased mind. Critics who had once championed him now dismissed his work as melancholic neurosis. They wanted steam trains, factories, and sunlight. Friedrich offered them tombstones, ruins, and twilight. For nearly 60 years, Casper David Friedrich ceased to exist. This creates a suspenseful, almost terrifying gap in the historical record, a dark age for the master of darkness. Where were the paintings during this half-century of silence? They were in jeopardy. They hung in damp corridors where mould bloomed on the varnish. They were rolled up in attics subjected to the freezing winters and sweltering summers, the paint cracking and flaking like the skin of the dead. Some were used to patch draughty windows. Others were simply lost, vanishing into the ether. The sea of ice, that jagged hymn to the indifference of nature, remained unsold for years, a stark reminder of his commercial failure, eventually finding its way into obscurity before being recognized for the radical masterpiece it was. But the greatest danger was not physical destruction. It was the destruction of his identity. In the inventories of the late 19th century, his works were frequently misattributed. Paintings by his imitators were labelled as Friedrich's, while his own transcendent works were ascribed to lesser students. His specific, biting, spiritual touch was forgotten. The man who had stared into the abyss was now confused with the Sunday painters of pretty landscapes. He was a footnote, a ghost story told by a few aging academics, a warning of what happens when an artist looks too long into the fog. The world was busy building empires of steel and iron. Germany was unifying, industrializing, and marching toward a very different kind of destiny. The quiet piety of Friedrich's lone figures standing before the vastness of creation seemed to have no relevance to a nation obsessed with power and machinery. The temple of nature had been paved over, and yet there is a strange, vibrating tension in this silence. Art does not die, it hibernates. Like the seeds buried deep beneath the snow in his winter landscapes, the work was waiting. It possessed a latent power that the Victorian era could suppress but not extinguish. In the dark corners of provincial museums and private homes, the paintings continue to emit their strange radioactive signal. The wanderer still stood above the sea of fog, waiting for someone to climb the mountain and stand beside him. The monk still stood on the shore, the only barrier between humanity and the nothingness. They were time bombs, ticking softly in the dark, waiting for the frequency of the world to change again. The turn of the century brought the first tremors of resurrection. It began not in Germany, but in Norway, with an art historian named Andreas Aubert. In the late 1890s, Aubert stumbled across the broken trail of Friedrich's legacy while researching another artist. It was a detective story of the highest order. Aubert found himself tracking a phantom. He dug through crumbling archives, wiped layers of soot from unrecognized canvases, and began to piece together the fragmented body of the master. He realized with a growing sense of shock that this forgotten man, this melancholic outcast, had actually anticipated the future of art. Aubert saw what the realists had missed. Friedrich wasn't painting landscapes. He was painting the internal architecture of the human mind. He was the grandfather of symbolism, a precursor to surrealism, a man who had dissolved the world to find the spirit. The centennial exhibition of German art in Berlin in 1906 became the flashpoint. When the gathered works were finally unveiled, stripped of the grime of neglect, the effect was electric. the viewers of the early 20th century, themselves standing on the precipice of a modern world filled with anxiety and existential dread, looked into Friedrich's canvases and saw their own reflections. The isolation, the loneliness, the feeling of being small in the face of vast, incomprehensible forces. Suddenly, Friedrich was not old-fashioned. He was contemporary. He was urgent. The erasure was over. The dead man had walked out of the grave. But the story of his survival has a final, cruel twist of suspense. Just as his reputation was being rebuilt, the physical threats returned with a vengeance. On June 6, 1931, a fire ripped through the Munich glass palace. It was an inferno that consumed over 3,000 paintings. Among the ashes were 9 of Friedrich's major works, masterpieces that had survived the indifference of the 19th century. The damp attics and the poverty of his estate were incinerated in a single afternoon. We know them today only through black and white photographs, ghosts of ghosts. The winter landscape, the departure, works of profound beauty, reduced to carbon atoms and memory. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of what remained. The erasure had failed to kill his name, but it had succeeded in permanently blinding us to parts of his vision. We are left with the survivors, the lucky ones that escaped the fire and the forgetfulness. As the narrative of Casper David Friedrich moves from the silence of the grave to the clamour of modern canonization, we are forced to reckon with the terrifying precariousness of legacy. He had predicted in his quiet way that, "One day I shall be with you." He was right. But he had to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, a valley that lasted nearly 100 years to get here. He is no longer forgotten. He is the giant upon whose shoulders the modern imagination stands, staring out into a fog that is no longer terrifying because it is unknown, but terrifying because we finally recognize it as our own. Friedrich didn't he just paint landscapes? He painted the silence between heartbeats. His figures turn their backs to us not to shut us out, but to invite us to face the void together. Though fires and indifference tried to erase him, the wanderer remains, forever suspended above the mist, reminding us that the most profound truths are often hidden in the fog. He is finally with us, just as he predicted. Thank you for joining this journey into the sublime. If you are moved by this story, please leave a like and subscribe for more explorations of history's enigmas. Until next time, keep watching the horizon.